But this is the second part of the session on stress and resilience. And I'm very happy to introduce Carol Ryff, who is, if I get to the right page, a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of the Institute of Aging there. And her talk is on the varieties of resilience and MIDUS.
Okay, thank you. I might have to speak loud. Can you hear me to cover the din outside? It's just as well we don't have a big crowd at this moment because I'm going to start my talk in a way that I don't usually do. So let me start with this slide. So in these days of amazing public talks on the internet, on TED, Technology, Education, and Design, where one can find amazing speakers covering just about every topic, there is this admonition. This is a cartoon from the New Yorker, but I love this cartoon because the message is basically we need icebreakers. We need to share something interesting about ourselves. And this slide also made me think about Carol Worthman's wonderful comment yesterday, which is why I like having anthropologists in the room, because they make such intriguing observations. They ask really great questions that I believe really make our research more interesting. So her question yesterday, when she began to comment on the panel, was, how did we all come to this point? How did we all come to this point in time? And I think that's a great question because it can be answered in a way that involves narrative, that involves personal stories, which anthropologists are so good at. And so I'm going to share with you some of my personal journey to this point. So these two little ladies grew up in a small town in Wyoming, the only kind of towns there are in Wyoming. This is in my high school senior yearbook. The blonde is me, and Linda, my cousin, you were known as the Ryff cousins. Linda, my cousin, grew up to be voted in our senior year the most attractive senior girl, along with my boyfriend, who was voted the most attractive senior boy. Meanwhile, I won the competition in Platte County, Wyoming, for the Junior Miss competition. And then I went to Laramie, where I competed with other winners across other counties, and I basically got fourth runner-up. You can laugh. Not very impressive, given when you consider it's Wyoming, where there are never more than 5 people competing for anything. So I think about this and I think, well, perhaps therein lies my calling to become a geek, a research geek, who has basically devoted her career to asking questions about how do people find meaning and direction in their lives, how do they experience self-realization, positive self-regard, in the face of the existential challenges that life throws at them. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I want to say here at the beginning, because this is about resilience, I just want to offer some observations about why I think resilience is such an interesting topic. The first reason is that it juxtaposes the positive and the negative in human experience. And most research does one or the other. I know this is an overstatement, but it's an overstatement that is legitimate to make. Health research tends to ignore the positive in the main. In the main, it is about pathways to illness, dysfunction, disability, disease, and death. On the other hand, we now have the positive psychology movement, some of which I hold in high disregard, which ignores the negative. That's one of its primary liabilities for which it is rightfully castigated. In addition, I think resilience is such an interesting topic because it brings into high relief the volitional aspects of human adaptation. It's really about the effortful, engaged organism, and that's what I want to study. So MIDUS is in my title. MIDUS is the acronym that stands for Midlife in the U.S. And I'm going to be reporting findings from this national study of Americans that was initiated in 1995 with over 7,000 Americans aged 25 to 74, including 900 pairs of twins. I'll just throw that in. MIDUS was a novel study. In fact, it's not hyperbole to say it broke new ground in population-based research because of its heavy emphasis on positive psychological and social factors that are being linked to a whole host of things, including biological risk factors, neuroscience, health endpoints. And note the language up in the top corner. It was designed to advance knowledge of factors that promote positive health and resilience. This brochure is on the MIDUS website that I'll show you in just a minute, but this is just kind of an overview of the broad content of the MIDUS study. It is one of these great big studies where you're trying to get your arms around an enormous amount of information that basically represents, in some ways, different disciplines, different disciplinary silos that we have all been trained in, and we're trying to basically put these many disciplines together in a national study of Americans. So I think MIDUS is a response to the weird problem. I think it is wonderful in that regard. It's not a perfect study. For those of you who work with the data set, you know it's not perfect, but it certainly has sociodemographic diversity, which is hugely important in looking at pathways through all of this complexity and how people get to different health endpoints as they age. It's funded by the National Institute on Aging, but the baseline study, which started in 1995, was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And I think at that point in time, NIH, not a single institute would have touched it. It looked like a UFO because it was so broad and all-encompassing. It wasn't disease-specific. It wasn't focused on a particular etiological pathway to a given outcome. It was basically saying these psychological, social, and behavioral factors are important in studying a whole host of outcomes, and we should be doing this in population-based research. So the second wave of funding, which occurred 9 to 10 years after the baseline, was funded by the National Institute on Aging. It was a program project grant divided into these 5 projects that I don't have time to go through. They represent the strategies we use for collecting this rich, in-depth data on Americans. The projects, the more costly, the more time and labor-intensive projects like the biomarker projects and the neuroscience projects are based on subsamples of the main sample. But they're still really big samples. For example, the neuroscience sample has about 300 people in it. This is our website, which I would encourage you to visit, but the main message is what I've put in big words right here on the side. These data are publicly available. We share. We share. And I'm really proud of that because I think this kind of broad integrative research is something that we want everybody out there to have some opportunity to participate in. If you look on the right, you will see options to click on to basically get data access. This is an incredibly well-documented, user-friendly data set. We get messages about that all the time. So I would encourage you to use the data. I'm also very proud of this. Why am I proud of this? It isn't just the sheer numbers of the publications from the study, That's important, especially since I'm spending much of my life running after money to keep this beast going and to keep it growing. But it's because it speaks to the engagement of the scientific community with the data. So we are the most frequently downloaded data set at the National Archive of Aging Data Sets at the University of Michigan. So back to resilience. I would agree. It is a messy literature. There's many different things that have been written about resilience. I still think it's a worthy and important topic to study. We need to bring some precision to it. These all represent old books, relatively old. We recently saw a handbook published on the topic of resilience, which I think speaks to the fact that it has become a more established area of research. But actually, in the spirit of good ethnography, the kinds of rich narratives that anthropologists remind us to pay attention to because we can learn so much from them, I want to just highlight some of the books that have been incredibly influential to me in thinking about human resilience. At the top of the list is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is about his 3 years in a Nazi concentration camp. The man was an MD. He thought a lot about the immune system. He thought about people, if they weren't gassed, if they weren't shot. Many were dying because they gave up hope, which he interpreted in terms of what was going on with their immune systems. But he managed, during this most horrific of horrific experiences, to find meaning in it, and came out of this experience creating a whole form of psychotherapy, logotherapy, that is really about the search for meaning in the context of adversity. This is another great example. I don't know how many of you have read about the life of Mark Mathabane, who grew up under apartheid in South Africa, in the townships. His early life was absolute abject poverty, humiliation, just unbelievably difficult experiences, but he comes out of it. And the book gives you an understanding of what were some of the protective influences that made this possible for him. I think Dorothy Allison's book, Bastard Out of Carolina, she grew up in poverty and experienced as a child abuse at the hands of her mother's partner. This book was actually made into a movie. Most recently, you can see I gravitate to reading this kind of stuff because I'm really interested in the inside experience of what it means to be resilient. This book, just published in 2012, is about the life of Ben Matlin, who was born with spinal muscular atrophy. He was one of the first wheelchair students at Harvard to graduate from Harvard, and this was well before the disability rights movement. He actually played an important role in the disability rights movement. He married, he had 2 children while his body was continuing to deteriorate. He wrote books, and he became, I think, noticed, that is, by a large crowd of people because he became a commentator for National Public Radio. So some of you have perhaps heard him. He's remarkable. Okay, so what do I mean by resilience? When I speak to kind of public audiences, I talk about it just as prevailing in the face of adversity. That definition is okay for me because it can encompass many different types of adversity and it can encompass many different forms of prevailing. But here I'll refer to the capacity to maintain or regain health and well-being in the face of challenge or adversity. And now in this section I'm going to sail through a whole bunch of slides that are in this publication that is soon to appear, which I would be happy to share with people. So hang on, we're going to go through this quickly because I want to have some time at the end for some additional comments. So my road to resilience is actually through, not surprisingly, my interest in psychological well-being, related to this article I published in 1989 by the title, Happiness is Everything or Is It?
My answer was no, it's not. There are other things we need to be paying attention to, key dimensions of what it means to be functioning positively as a human being. I drew on a lot of theoretical perspectives to come up with these dimensions, but once we had developed structured quantitative scales for measuring these things, which have now been translated into 30 different languages and are being used everywhere, we can ask questions about who maintains psychological well-being in the face of challenge or adversity. And also the question, does that matter for their health? So this is my well-being pie, the lemon pie. The pieces in the middle are the 6 components of well-being. They're fairly self-descriptive. The blue on the outside are the theoretical perspectives I drew on to come up with these 6 components. They didn't spring de novo from my head. They sprang from formulating points of convergence in these prior perspectives. So if you are functioning well, you believe phenomenologically, subjectively, that your life has meaning and purpose and direction. You feel that you can manage the environment around you. You have good relationships with other people. You feel that you can march to your own drummer, something of a Western component here. You feel that you are making the most of your talents and capacities. That's the one that comes closest to what Aristotle formulated as the highest of all human goods, something he called eudaimonia. And you have self-acceptance, but it's not about superficial self-esteem. It's about knowing yourself, your strengths and your weaknesses, and feeling positive self-regard, warts and all. So I'm going to talk about 2 primary varieties of resilience in the MIDUS study that build on some presentations we heard about yesterday. So I'm very interested in resilience in the face of social inequalities. And some of you may dispute this, but it seems fairly obvious to me that in all societies, everywhere, social inequalities exist. Social inequalities are ubiquitous. And they are also, interestingly enough, common in non-human primates, where we see a lot of emphasis on status hierarchies. So to me, this represents a kind of universal in a type of challenge that many people are confronted with. And so we're going to look at how people fare with regard to social inequalities. We're going to bring in some of my measures of well-being. We're going to bring in some other psychosocial measures to basically show, even though on average the data underscores inequality in various biological health outcomes. That is, people with less education have more biological risk than people with more education. Those are averages. And my quest is to get off the mean. I would even refer to it as the tyranny of the mean. We need to basically break into the variability because that's where we can learn something about people who, in the face of educational disadvantage, are nonetheless doing well, and we can see if it matters for their health. So here's a study. Jen Morozink is a graduate student at Wisconsin. She's now Jen Boylan, recently married. This is a study where she first showed that those with lower educational attainment have higher levels of the inflammatory marker interleukin-6, but this effect is buffered by high psychological well-being. So this is basically, the bar graph basically underscores the gradient in levels of serum interleukin-6 as a function of educational status. Repeating what I just said, here's the scoop on interleukin-6 that we heard about yesterday. It's a marker involved in the etiology of numerous disease outcomes. That effect is moderated by, buffered by people who have high levels of well-being, positive relations with others, environmental mastery, self-acceptance, and positive affect. And this is one of the graphs showing this. So we have environmental mastery on the x-axis, IL-6 on the vertical axis. You see at the low end of environmental mastery the usual gradient. At the high end of environmental mastery, you see that the gradient is gone. This is the same finding for purpose in life, and this is from the actual publication that shows this role of high well-being protecting against high interleukin-6 among the less educated. Then I'm delighted to actually put up these findings. They represent the engagement of Greg Miller and Edith Chen with the MIDUS data set, along with a number of other MIDUS investigators. This is an extension of some of what we heard Edith talk about yesterday, framed as pathways to resilience, focusing on maternal nurturance, again, as a buffer against the effects of childhood poverty on metabolic syndrome in midlife. So the first finding is that childhood poverty predicts higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome, but not among those who had high levels of maternal nurturance. So what is metabolic syndrome? The graph there gives you the bullets for the components that go into metabolic syndrome. In the bar graph at the top, you see the number of those components as a function of parents' educational attainment. You see that the components go up among those with less educated parents. And the lower graph is for those who actually meet diagnostic criteria for being classified as having metabolic syndrome as a function of parents' educational status. But this is the important buffering finding. So look particularly at the black line in the top graph. High maternal nurturance. Those are individuals with high maternal nurturance. You can see that they have lower levels of a number of metabolic components across all these levels of parents' educational attainment. So maternal nurturance is protecting against high metabolic syndrome, again, among the less educated. Margie Lockman published this study that has been actually widely cited from the baseline MIDUS data. It has no biology in it, but it was an interesting study that showed, not surprisingly, if you have lower income, you also report lower levels of health, but not if you have a high sense of control. So sense of control also serves as a buffer here. Among low-income respondents, those with a high sense of control reported better health. These are some findings we have a lot of interest in race and health in the MIDUS study, including people using those in the office formulations of perceived discrimination. They're good measures. This is basically showing among stigmatized groups, acknowledging discrimination may serve protective roles among lower SES minorities. So I'm also interested in resilience in the face of the challenges of aging. One challenge of aging is actually compromised well-being. These are longitudinal data from the MIDUS study. They've been replicated in multiple studies, time 1 to time 2 changes. You can see that purpose in life goes down with aging a lot. However, this is not MIDUS data, but it's important data from David Bennett's group doing community epidemiological research. He shows that purpose in life, there are older people who don't fit that average. And those individuals who have high purpose in life show protective benefits against Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. They also live longer. We know that aging brings increased risk for poor sleep, but that's not true among older women who have high psychological well-being. They have reduced risk of poor sleep. We also know that aging, if you live long enough, you're going to have chronic conditions. Comorbidity is a normal part of aging. Normal aging, comorbidity, however, fuels inflammation so that it can bring even more chronic conditions. But that problem between comorbidity and fueling inflammation does not exist among those who have high well-being. And these are the graphic findings just published in the Journal of Gerontology that basically makes the point that as chronic conditions increase, those with higher well-being are protected against this elevated inflammatory risk, measured both in terms of IL-6 and CRP. Here's a study shows that functional health declines with aging, but not among those with high social support, sense of control, and frequent exercise. We have great measures of cognition in the MIDUS study. I don't have time to go through them. If you standardize the measures and you look at age differences at baseline, you see this. There's clearly a downward trajectory in these things, but there's variation around those averages. And again, things can be done that reduce the risk that you're going to show this decline. Frequent computer activity predicts better executive function. Net of confounds, including cognitive ability. Positive relationship histories predict better executive function and memory, episodic memory, net of confounds. I don't have time to talk about the cancer survivors. There are interesting stories there. There's also interesting work going on with regard to the neuroscience of resilience. How is it instantiated in the brain? This is a published study that I don't have time to go through. So here are some of the newer findings from the MIDUS study. I'll share my slides. I'm behind time-wise. Those with higher well-being in the MIDUS study, we bring people into the laboratory and they participate in emotional reactivity and recovery protocols. Those with higher well-being show better emotional recovery from, but not reactivity to, negative stimuli. Similarly, those with higher conscientiousness show better emotional recovery from, but not reactivity to, negative stimuli. And a more recent finding that's now in review shows sustained ventral striatal activity predicts well-being and cortisol output. The punchline is those who show repeated engagement in reward circuitry when responding to multivalent stimuli have higher well-being and better regulation of the HPA axis. We are doing culture and resilience. We have a MIDUS and MIDUS comparison. I don't have time to go into these. We're looking at SES and health outcomes in both the Japanese study. Shinobu's involved in this. Hazel Marcus is involved in this. A number of other investigators. Certainly, we find evidence of social inequalities in health in both cultures, but whether it is objective or subjective, SES seems to matter by culture. There's a bug after me. And also, we find that your status in the hierarchy is linked in differential ways to various emotions, like anger. Culture has to be implicated in interpreting any of those findings. This is just a finding underscoring the Japanese differences in Japanese regulation of positive and negative emotion, dialectical differences, dialectical emotional styles. I apologize for going through this so quickly. I'm almost done. A big problem with the West, in my view, is basically how we think about positive and negative affect, captured by this cartoon. And even better captured by this recent publication, a French philosopher. The French do philosophy, I think, better than anyone. It is full of incisive criticism, le mot juste, all the way through. He talks about current preoccupations with happiness as representing the advent of banality. He quotes from Voltaire to talk about how felicity and vacuity go hand in hand. His assessment of the Dalai Lama is priceless. A hammy prophet who's full of amiable twaddle designed to suit everyone. And then he concludes, it's better to lead a rich life with tears than a happy one without meaning. The defeat of our illusion always opens the door to miracles. So my conclusions, racing through this. Prior health research has been blind largely to human resilience. I believe human resilience is a hugely important, empirically tractable topic. It appears to be consequential for health. We need to do more research on that. And I didn't have time to go into it, but there's also work being done in multiple circles to show that human resilience can be promoted. Thank you.